what are you seeing as sort of a killer app in this kind of AR with movement space that you are in going forward?
Well, we're trying to figure that out. We dropped a couple as betas. We're going to gear up in Q4 and drop a lot more. We picked music because both Christina and I have backgrounds there, and it was something to try. These two are the artists we worked with own their content, so we didn't have to get into the quagmire of dealing with labels. But we think maybe more visual things. We think things with dance. We think things that are actually just funny and ridiculous. That's what people have been encouraging us to do, things that are a little more ridiculous. There's a volumetric video of Lil Nas X that's been floating around from one of our friends down in LA. Jadu produced it. They produced a musical performance, which is interesting, but they also produced these little excerpts that allow you to create your own content. He just says little lines. Hey, how's it going? Oh, are you upset at me? What can I do? And basically people have taken that, they've built their own little skits, and they have used, his music video, his little trip to hell, and people have kind of played off that and created some really funny content. So we're going to lean into that direction and see what happens. Again, our differentiator is the overlay. To answer your question more broadly, whatever will go viral will, be the killer app. It's always easy to say that. It's always hard to come up with a thing that will go viral. So we're just going to throw some things against the wall and see what happens.
What I love about that is that you will have an endless amount of new experiences can those experiences become NFTs? Can someone then sell their interaction with a top tier music performer as a new NFT? Because it's kind of like a mashup.
That's interesting. I haven't even thought about that. Now you've given me a whole new topic to worry about.
And royalties surrounding this.
Yeah, I don't know. That's interesting.
I feel like if, Beyonce and Jay-Z did something with Little Nas, with one of those videos, that would probably be that many more times valuable as a resold or new NFT, actually.
Yeah, I think it would be. That's a very interesting thing to think about. And again, as long as, from our standpoint, as long as our owner of our NFT is just pinned to that bottom left and they get to brag to their buddies, that's what we're betting on right now. Who knows what the world will evolve to. We ultimately would love to have competitions. We deliberately dropped more than one just for the fun of it on each of these. We dropped 11. There was no magic number. It was just kind of cool. But it would be really exciting if over time the 11 owners are competing. And there's a leaderboard for who's getting the most views, who's getting the most, engagement, attribution in a bunch of ways. If we can create that dynamic, then we're onto something.
Like the next generation American Idol / The Voice, but with NFTs. I love it.
This is why I wanted to come on here. I can steal all these great ideas that you guys are tossing out.
You're
Thanks.
free at the moment. No, I love it. I think this is a play. This is where the NFT space is going. Is this sort of interactive experiences? We've been waiting for them to happen in digital media for decades. I think with NFTs, you can actually envision this happening. So in terms of DAOs, I'd like to go back to Drew and ask Drew that question that I had. What are some of the challenges in a consensus mechanism that you've seen to date? And how can one avoid some of these challenges in setting up a DAO?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of directions to go with that. Most of the consensus mechanisms being used, so there's a couple things. Most of them are off chain. So they'll do something like enable voting. The voting will be stored in IPFS or something like that. And then at some point it'll expire. And when it expires, it may write it to the chain to sort of store the final result. I think the downside to that is you're losing a lot of the functional potential of having all the votes secured on the blockchain. The problem is with Ethereum network, gas is so high that like no one wants to pay $30 just to say that they want to be able to add a new member to the DAO, right? It's just not worthwhile. And among a 10,000 person DAO, it's like, 300 grand just to add a new member for voting. So, I think as these sort of environments build out on other blockchains or level 2 networks that can make that gas price lower, I think that will make on-chain voting more tenable. One of the issues is that getting everyone to vote. The blockchain enables voting. People authenticate typically through a wallet. So you have a wallet ID. You may have coin. It varies on how they define membership, typically some kind of a token. So when you have that token, you can authenticate in, but it's pretty low votership. So, I think what would be interesting is some mechanism for sending notifications through wallets would be super cool. I haven't heard of anyone doing anything like that. But that would allow people to know that their vote was requested, things like that. I think that would be a pretty decent ad. And everything is kind of version 1. I mean, you get to like Aragon and Colony, they're fairly advanced, but they require a pretty large commitment to get involved in all that. And then I'll add one other quick piece is that, with DAOs, there isn't really a good legal definition of what a DAO is. So you can be a DAO in the virtual world and you can, use that for consensus and you can be loosely organized. But then when it comes to taxing the treasury and how you spend, are you an LLC? And if you are, then you're not really a DAO because now everyone's got to be a member of the LLC and you lose a lot of that. I know Wyoming has legalized DAOs. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't tell you the ins and outs of what that means. But I do think having some sort of taxable organization that is under a DAO allows for this. Because, a lot of people are pseudonymous in this world. So that's something we have to contend with moving forward, and international as well.
Yeah, the taxation issue clearly will be sort of resolved like all the other regulatory issues very carefully and sometimes with lawsuits, unfortunately.
Exactly. Yeah.
That puts, I would say, a DAO, wherever it's organized, pick a jurisdiction, right? Unless that government has some sort of a regulatory framework and taxation framework for it, it kind of puts it does it put all the members at risk? That's kind of the question, or how does that work with the membership of a DAO?
Yeah, I mean, these are all good questions that, like you say, will be answered in the courts most likely. And hopefully, I mean, it's cool to see that Wyoming did that, and hopefully other states will follow suit. And ideally at the national level in the US, I think in other countries, it might be a little easier to have this kind of organization.
Yeah, it's unclear at the moment. This, as you pointed out, this will be developing, especially with the Wyoming DAOs, et cetera, and how the IRS treats the taxation on these organizations. So you're saying you can have an LLC or a C Corp under the DAO. And do you have any examples of that actually being implemented today?
I'm sure there are. I don't know how a lot of these DAOs are legally structured. I don't know if anyone else is a member. The DAOs I'm members of are mainly, they don't really have a deep treasury, so it hasn't been an issue so far. Like one of the projects, the DAO project that I'm working on, we do have a grant, but I just took it personally. I'm basically just paying taxes on it and then distributing it to everyone else. But I think a lot of compromises are being made at this point.
I think Christian's here from Sestiny Capital. He said that if you have regulatory exposure, you did implement the technology correctly, period. Christian, you want to comment on this?
Well, at the core, obviously, the idea of all blockchain-based solutions is to facilitate peer-to-peer value transfer, right? So in that context, regulatory solutions, regulatory laws typically address the middleman problem, not the individual, right? The tax issue is a different one. It's an entirely different issue that you should mitigate yourself with your own entity, right? That part you can mitigate with a decentralized autonomous organization.
You're basically saying the technology allows you to implement it in such a way that it's not sort of in a regulatory crosshairs, or just it's allowing for sort of regulatory approval piecemeal?
No. Obviously, I mean, the one thing that should be obvious, and I keep repeating myself, you heard me say this many times at this point in time, regulation addresses the behavior of people within a particular jurisdiction. And needless to say, all these solutions that we're talking about are by default global. So there's no way that you can comply with all the laws that are out there to begin with, but then more importantly, you should implement the technology in the way it was intended, which is to facilitate peer-to-peer interactions. So at that point in time, you probably don't have much, if any, ideally regulatory exposure at all, right?
Yeah, so it's like the full decentralization. If it was fully decentralized, it's de facto global.
Yes, I mean there's no direct correlation there, and decentralization is still largely misunderstood, right? If there's only one person running a node, most people would say, well, it's not decentralized, which is technically right, but the topic of decentralization is really not the decentralization of technology. That's a different issue. It's the decentralization of incentive mechanisms. So if I was the only one running a node and whatever mining reward or otherwise token I maintain on that platform accrues value, then I would be the last person to misuse my power by doing something nefarious and run the node in a way that people would disapprove of, because I would just erode my own value at that point in time. Right, so it's really a matter of permissionlessness, if you will, whether or not something is quote unquote decentralized. And Nicola and I share the same chair, it seems like.
At the
comfy.
the Star Trek chairs, I guess.
No, it's a very cheap, surprisingly comfortable chair you find on Amazon for just $140 or something.
Oh wow, I need to order one.
Yes,
I can be in the club.
Yes, here's my affiliate link.
I will. You'll get 10 cents for it. So Juan, let's just talk a little bit more about stable coins. And it's kind of, it's an interesting, I would say, way of easing people into some of these spaces. How are they going to actually affect the adoption of DeFi?
I think it's just gotten a lot of people comfortable with DeFi, right? If institutions that are looking into the space, right, and there are many of them, can look to a unit of account that they can translate to the way that they've managed traditionally, that's something they feel more comfortable with. We also look at DAI. Like DAI, I think, did like an enormous innovation in the space, issuing something stable that then you could map the time value of money to. So overall, I mean, if I were to look at some of the things that kickstarted DeFi outside of just Ethereum as a platform, I think DAI itself is something that brought a lot of comfort to the space in terms of being able to initiate lending markets, borrowing markets, and then USDC on top of that, just giving investors and the DeFi community as a whole security that they would, if they wanted to, that they would be able to redeem one USDC for $1. So I think that's kind of where we are now. I think there's a lot to work. I think the community wants to have a truly decentralized stablecoin. I think that would be healthy for the market as well. It's just like a really interesting design space that I'm not sure if I'm not sure where it'll go. So curious on everybody's thoughts in terms of how we think about, a stable unit of account to be able to price this crypto economy in. That's like an interesting debate, an interesting design space for anybody that's building in crypto.
That, and also, is the stable coin, should it be tied to a US dollar or sort of a basket of global currencies? Those are, I think that's something that Christian actually knows more about than I do.
Yeah, I mean, I had, I don't know, a couple of 100 hours of discussions with people that work on central-based digital currencies, right? And so if you look at all these different design papers and what they're talking about in terms of the problems that they are addressing, you will actually notice that they're not addressing the problems that we're currently already solving in the quote-unquote DeFi space. So what I mean by that specifically, the main concern that people around the world have, and that's less true for the developed nations and democratic countries, is simply that of government surveillance, right? So, and if when we have an actual digital bearer instruments, what I mean by that, something that I can actually transfer peer-to-peer without any KYC, to simplify this. So at that point in time, I deliver something that's useful, but that's usually not what these design papers talk about. And then second, the obvious one is that any fiat currency, for the time that you're holding it, and even the packs that you're holding, is losing purchasing power continuously, right? So even if you believe the utterly misguided narrative here in the United States of that supposedly fairly low inflation rate, it doesn't really matter, because you're already seeing within the DeFi space now that wallets and custodial exchanges compete on APY, and then it's hovering around 8-9% now for stablecoins. So the larger point here being is, if and when and where we see the actual implementation of CBDCs outside of China, which I kind of ignore because it's kind of it will be an island. I would not recommend anybody ever touching it with a 5-foot pole. But at that point in time, what I expect to see is that one country by accident will release a digital bearer instrument that's US dollar denominated, because governments and the people that they hire are notoriously incompetent. And so they might want to issue something that resembles more a DLT-based system rather than a blockchain, to have control over that particular unit of account. But I think there is probably a 90% certainty at this point in time that within the next 18 months, we will see a US dollar denominated quote unquote CBDC come out that's an actual digital bearer instrument. So at that point in time, if and when and where that's compatible with certain wallets, all other stable coins become irrelevant, right? They have no reason to exist. Anyway, it's a much longer sermon that I have for that, but I'll spare you that.
Yeah, so like you're saying, like at the end of this process, if we can really create sort of peer-to-peer commerce, infrastructure globally, then there's really no need for some sort of a centralized currency or stable currency, period. Because all currency will be stable.
Yeah, well, so any CBDC, I forgot to mention, it's kind of included in the word, is legal tender. And so it will automatically have conversion rates and functions with the legacy systems, right? So that obviously has then a huge advantage over all the friction that we see right now in the wallet system, where all the on and off boarding is super expensive, right? And that won't happen. I can just offboard my CBDC, quote unquote, and pay something with that. So that's the huge advantage, and quote unquote onboarded. Right? It will solve that major bottleneck. It's not about the things that are already digitally native. Right? That's the current threshold in the overall system. If you look at DeFi, It just deals with digitally native products. It doesn't deal with real world economic activity.
And so how do those two actually meet, right? Because at the moment, huge amount of friction on this side, and DeFi, not that much friction at all based on what's going on. How do those two actually ever come together?
Yeah, it would be a CBDC that's compatible with all the legacy transfer systems, right? The Swifts and Visa networks and so forth, POS systems. And we know of a couple that are prepared to take those. And I'm not sure it's going to be compatible with Ethereum or specifically ERC20. But at that point in time, every wallet needs to obviously hurry and be able to implement that, right? Because every wallet, not every wallet, but most wallets right now have some form of cumbersome onboarding mechanism where they integrate with Wire or some other rent-seeking entity that charges enormous fees that make most transactions useless, right? Because if you can't pay with it because the fees are higher than what you would be paying with a credit card. So at that point in time, it becomes cost prohibitive.
So the final question I have here is, so is it sort of the bottleneck is really the legacy systems versus the newly developing ones?
Yeah, for the time being, for sure, right? So specifically when it comes to payment functions, right? So lending, obviously, we can already see that, and lending is easy to do digitally native because all lending already happens digitally native, right? So specifically bank lending, this is all digitally native already. It's just not digital bearer instruments. But payment functions, yeah, you have to be able to actually talk to the existing POS systems, etc., and they will hurry up and obviously facilitate payments in CBDCs, and or governments will just order that they have to accept it, right? That they have to be compatible with that.
So that's one bottleneck. And then if you look at, the stable coins that have been developed, Juan, do they see themselves as sort of, a pathway, a bridge to bridge the gap here?
Well, it's highly fragmented, right? I mean, that's an example I've made for a long time. You have to always look at the use case. The use case of Tether is to stay on a centralized exchange and exchange it against mostly BTC. So that is like 90-some% of its velocity on a daily basis. And in that for this particular use case, it obviously beats the US dollar by a wide margin, right? The velocity of the US dollar is like 1.4 and a quarter. And the velocity of Tether is like 4 or 5 times its market cap in a day. So again, you want to look at the particular use case. So that's why things are interesting that build like the intermittent market pairs for things like remittance. But you want to build basically a cohort around that play. It's always a very narrow use case at this point in time.
Juan, so your use case is USDC, so it's US dollar. Are you guys experiencing a bit of an exponential growth in its applications at the moment? Is it a slower uptake? What do you see in its near future?
For now, it's mostly based on, where I see most of the growth in the short term is in marketplaces that seek to be fungible with blockchains that USDC is native on. So anything on Solana, anything on Ethereum, that seems to be escalating because players in the space that do want to enable other rails to find payments on, find comfort in having USDC as their payment rail. But long term, I think definitely want to adopt the majority of the use cases. So we have institutional trading partners that use USDC for liquidity and also for everything that Chris was mentioning. I would say Tether probably has a little bit of an advantage there for sure, especially in Asian markets. But yeah, across the board, remittances, DeFi, payments, and merchant systems, and yeah, I think that's kind of what we're seeing right now. But we're always being surprised with what people are looking to build with USDC and stablecoins.
Well, maybe you wanna remind me. I talked to a lot of your colleagues in the past, but what does it take to become an issuer?
An issuer of a USDC to actually mint USDC?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Well, you would have to be part of the Center consortium, which right now is just Coinbase and Circle.
Okay, but are there any clear guidelines to how you become an issuer?
There's not really. That's not something that Circle spearheads. That's something that Centers as its own independent entity spearhead. So they have like their own, folks that are working precisely on the standards for anybody that's joining the consortium and that's going to issue, whether it's USDC or setting the standard for other countries that other currencies, that may be getting tokenized.
Right, and you probably touched on that earlier, but I didn't hear it. So on how many blockchains is it working right now? And which one?
Five.
Five.
Ethereum, Solana, Tron, Algorand, and Stellar.
Okay.
Which is primarily driven by the use cases that we are seeing. It's really when clients that are looking to build on something like that, it's really kind of when we assess it and issue where our clients need liquidity.
Interesting. Because on Stellar, I can just kind of form it myself if I wanted to, right?
What do you mean? Like
I could create my own stablecoin on Stellar, period, right? Am I mistaken?
I think you could build synthetic assets on
Right.
other blockchains as well, right? I think it's just a matter of first of all serving as an on-ramp. So if you create a Circle account with anybody that has a legal entity in the US, or most entities would be able to mint USDC with US dollars. And then the reverse is also true. So if you use cases that have deep liquidity pools in USDC, just want that fungibility and that access to those markets, particularly if you're coming from DeFi. But yeah, no, I think Ethereum, Solana, and are both well equipped to build synthetic assets. I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I was gonna say I have a question for Drew on the DAOs. So with how much DAOs are managing, and I don't recall the exact figure, but I know it's a lot of money. And the inherent risk that this poses on like DAO treasuries. I've seen that a large chunk of these hold their treasury in their native tokens. They're not very diversified. So any thoughts there as you think about like DAO treasury strategy, right? And how do they mitigate the effects of Bitcoin volatility, Ethereum volatility, and what are some of the things that maybe DAOs could be thinking about and could be doing to diversify their treasuries?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so part of the issue is that crypto is so tribal, and that people tend to be like possibly over enthusiastic about their own coin. So I think that's part of the issue, and that's certainly what we saw after a lot of the ICOs in 2017, as people were holding their coin and ETH, and when things really dropped, they sort of lost a lot of their coin raised money and stuff. So part of the issue is really just an approach issue. But I think you're absolutely right that there should be, just like any organization doesn't just put everything in a bank account. Managing your treasury is something intelligent that you need to do, and you should have someone allocated, or at least have consensus on doing it. And there should be a stable of stable coins, and there should be some Bitcoin and some diversification into other coins in addition to their own coin, especially if they're using their own coin and need the liquidity. But that's a great point. I mean, I think that's that's something. Maybe there's something out there, but I haven't seen a specific tool that's dedicated just to that. But that would be,
I think it's
very cool.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I think it's definitely an interesting opportunity space. And a little bit of where I'm headed with this, and this is kind of like a follow-up question, is just like we're seeing corporations across the globe diversify their treasury with Bitcoin, should we be seeing the reverse from DAOs? Should DAOs be looking maybe not at equities, but at other things that you can own in the off-chain world to diversify your DAO treasury?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, remains to be answered. I know a lot of these DAOs too, they're like with Stacks, for example, the whole Stacks 2 is based on if you stack your stacks, as they call it, which is not quite the same as proof of stake. It's actually a proof of transfer model. You earn Bitcoin because it's secured to the Bitcoin network. So, some of these kind of DeFi plays, the treasuries will actually stake or stack or, whatever with their coins so that they're earning interest and possibly maintaining operation expenses through that, depending on how deep their treasury is. I mean, there's a lot of options. Yeah, offline. I mean, diversification is diversification. I don't know. The problem once you get offline is you're not in the trustless world anymore, right? Now there has to be, if you're going to buy real property, who's going to manage that, and how do you ensure that the ownership is there? I mean, there's the tenuous connection between NFT and the real world that some people are battling with, but I think that's an issue once you get offline, is how do you make that trustless?
And I think Christian did a very good presentation here at the salon at the beginning of the year about real use cases for NFTs. And we're seeing just the world getting NFT'd, almost, all the real assets in one way or another are either NFT'd or in the process of being NFT'd. So that actually may become another interesting asset class that needs to be sort of examined in the treasury management functions.
Yeah, we actually have a. Oh, what's that? Oh, yeah. So one of our portfolio companies is Mintbase. They work both on Ethereum and Near. It's kind of a Shopify for NFTs, and we're meeting with a company later. What they do is they are a magazine as well as an aggregator for indie artists and in the music space. And so within that space, you have a lot of vinyl collectors, so people who still buy the old long plays. And so what we're discussing this afternoon is creating digital clones for that with additional then metadata attached to these NFTs that's very specific to that, let's call it asset class, to these items, right? So you want to know if they're in certain conditions, you want to take high resolution photos, and then you want to make those NFTs so that when you receive the items, you can inspect it and compare it with the NFT and see, yes, I got the correct long play. It doesn't have any scratches, just like the digital thing that I bought initially, right? You have a much more efficient secondary market at this point in time, right?
Yeah, and I saw a lot of private equity funds in the space digitizing assets that were, beyond just collections, things like whiskey, and 5 years from now as it matures, with Wave Financial. And so I think there's just going to be asset classes created with NFTing of the world as it happens that one could consider, some more interesting than others. As part of the treasury. We saw a lot of the coins being lost after the ICO and at some IEO raises in 2017, 18 as well. And I'm sure that the new DAOs and the new management teams may not make those mistakes, hopefully, going forward.